Welcome to the Mystic and the Skeptic, the show that asks the tough questions and explores different alternatives to today's pressing issues, theories, or enigmas.
A podcast devoted to the exploration of all things mystical, philosophical, scientific, political, conspiratorial, and cosmic. Join us in an exploration of the Mystic-Skeptic mindspace.
In this week's show, we're honored to have again our friend of the show, Mr. Brian Dunning. He is from the website Skeptoid. It's a nonprofit organization that helps debunk urban myths, issues related to health, all kinds of stuff that comes out in both the internet and out in the community that affect us. And the reason I wanted you back on the show is because we've been inundated with this allegation of fake news, but there's also all these types of conspiracy theories that are pervasive in the political world that are creating, in my eyes, a very scary place for us to live in. We hear of elections being turned not only by fake news from other countries being put online, but by wrong information or reframing events that have happened to bend them in a political direction. In one of our past shows, you mentioned that the only way to combat that type of stuff is with good ideas, but it seems like we're being overrun by that type of information. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that's one way to stop it. There's a number of ways that different groups are trying right now to stop the spread of misinformation online. There's all kinds of different sources, different types of misinformation. It's a pretty broad topic. I don't know, where do you want to start?
Well, the Pizzagate expose that you did on your side was excellent, and now even Fox News is complaining about it and connecting it to this other individual. I really don't want to say names in our show. I just want to give people kind of an impression of who we're talking about, because I don't want to get trolled, and I don't want our program that is informational to the community to be bogged down by that kind of stuff. But there's a particular individual who has been slowly rising to prominence, or he's already been interviewed, now is going to be on TV, where was pushing for pizzeria, trying to create problems, and was it killing people for Hillary Clinton? Can you give us a picture of how outrageous this idea is?
I don't go too deeply into any of those cases, because I just kind of sort of dismiss them all as just part of the problem. None of them are especially worthy of really any sort of real investigative attention. However, this one came to prominence because somebody believed it well enough to go down there with a gun and see if he could solve it. So Pizzagate was, it was originally some story that was written on the internet claiming that some of the Hillary Clinton associates were involved in a child trafficking sex ring that was taking place in some restaurants, particular one pizzeria. And I mean, any intelligent person kind of knows that that's silly at face value. However, the internet being what it is, and just about anything on the internet is believed by somebody, and there's even some people who believe just about anything passionately. Someone believed this well enough to load up a gun and go down there and see if he could rescue the children from, I guess, Hillary Clinton abusing them in the back room of a pizzeria. And so at that point, I think people started to take, geez, should we start taking this fake information, this misinformation, these false news stories that people write, should we start taking them seriously and trying to solve them? That's basically the Pizzagate story.
And what's interesting is that it sounds a lot like a story that I read. There was a book called Not for Sale, and it was, I believe, a sociologist who was doing research in the San Francisco area regarding human trafficking, and there was women who were being prostituted through different restaurants. So it seems like they take a kernel of truth and then they impose it into their preconceived ideas, and then they push it for political purposes. So, the one that is the most hot in everybody's mind right now is this famous individual who's been making a living spouting conspiracy theories. Both him and the person who is interviewing him for a big cable channel is the Sandy Hook Elementary conspiracy, and what this gentleman claims is that it never even happened at all, and that the parents of the children who were murdered or actors, people are outraged, but he still has a platform to keep pushing those ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, that raises a number of issues. Everything from liability for if he's actually breaking any laws, which is not at all clear, to his First Amendment rights. It's not a clear-cut situation. I mean, I can go on the internet and write a story saying that aliens just landed in France, and that's fake news. But am I breaking any law? Am I hurting anybody? Well, no, of course not. I'm under my rights to do such a thing. And that's one end of the spectrum. The situation you're talking about is kind of the other end of the spectrum, and there's everything in between. I sort of break down the whole quote-unquote fake news phenomenon into four basic types. One of them is honest misinformation, which there is a lot of on the internet. And you can take anything from all the websites selling these alternative medicine health supplements to psychic websites, all of this stuff that's honest misinformation. It's being promoted by people who actually believe in that stuff. It's not true, but there's no malice behind it, by and large. The second type I would point to would be basically pose. People who are deliberately writing fake stories for fun, or in some cases to try and accomplish something or to try and persuade people. The Pizzagate story would be this type. That was written by somebody who knew he was making something up. Whether he edited the story you talked about where, from a real human trafficking situation or not, I don't know. The third one I would talk about is clickbait. Websites that deliberately post any kind of sensational stuff for advertising purposes. And this might have some stuff that's true. It might have a lot of stuff about celebrities. It might have stuff that they make up. This category includes so-called satire websites that promote, they just write something insane that they know people are going to click on when they see it on Facebook. And they put a little disclaimer at the bottom of their website saying, hey, this is a satire webpage. So I call that all just clickbait BS. And then finally, the fourth type of fake news that I would describe is the most complicated. And that's where it's really just spin. Where the same thing happens and two different people, and it's usually two different political parties, are going to report it one way and the other one's going to report it the other way. And we've just seen this. I won't name names per your policy, but there were just some congressional hearings. Someone testified, and both political parties published news stories saying that the testimony supported their side. Kind of two exactly opposite interpretations of the same event. How is someone going to decide which one of those sides is quote-unquote fake news? It becomes very murky, and you find yourself in a position where, hey, someone's going to have to be the gatekeeper of what's true and what's not, and is it possible to have that be a completely unbiased source? So it's a difficult problem. A lot of different types of fake news, a lot of potential ways to solve it.
Well, and that one we can say the name because it's a public hearing. So Comey testified, and then not only was it spun to say that one party feels vindicated and the other one feels the same way, there was an individual who took the conversation between the previous FBI chief and one of the congressmen and misquoted and purposely changed what he said, and then made an article about how he had given information to reporters using the computers from the FBI and added a lot of extra intrigue to the story. And what I'm worried about, and I see this happen all the time, is that people who do not dig deeper, just a little research, like to see, is that really happen, they get bamboozled to believe that people are doing things that are not true, and then it supports their original agenda. And I guess you can't do anything about people who are close-minded to facts, but I feel that people who do that type of manipulation, they prey on the elderly, they prey on the uneducated, and people who might not have the ability to double-check the information. So it's a very challenging situation. Are you familiar with what happened with Qatar and how supposedly the Russian government used fake news to influence the other Arab nations to break ties with Qatar?
I've only heard of that at a headline level. It's not something that I've dug into at all.
Yeah, and then even that, we don't know if that's true. We don't know if that's a way to portray Russia in a negative light. And there's already a lot of talk about did Russia influence the elections here and trying to pin the tail on what happened. How do we end up in this situation? In your side, you have tackled some of these issues and given people more accurate information. What has been the response? I remember in a past show you mentioned that there's people who have contacted you and said, I believe in the 9/11 conspiracy, and now thanks to your research I've been able to step away from that. Is it similar with some of these type of conspiracies that are more complicated and harder to pinpoint?
Very much so. I mean, in what I do with Skeptoid and the Skeptoid podcast is education and giving people the tools to learn what's real from what's not. And education is, only one way to address the whole fake news phenomenon. It's going to be very successful with a small number of people, though, because of the average person who surfs the internet, who has the time or the energy or who cares enough to learn to develop the tools of critical thinking to better analyze. I mean, it's just not something that enters into most people's consciousness. So for my particular audience, yes, they're very grateful that we all work on developing these skills together. It's not something that I see as a viable solution for the larger problem, for the problem that affects the public to the level that an election could be swayed.
Have you done any research on climate change and the climate denial camp? Because I was watching a presentation where there was this very silly thing that a creationist mentioned or someone like that, they were saying CO2 comes out of everybody's breath. When they say that the CO2 levels have risen, it's just because there's more people in the world, ridiculing the idea that pollution is real. And then there was one of the president's advisors who was pushing the same type of stuff in front of two scientists. And it's unbelievable that you find an answer that meets your preconceived notions, and then that's it. There's no discussion about it. Tell us a little bit about your research.
That's a particularly difficult subject, because if you're familiar with the science, it's very clear. The answers are easy to understand. They're based on very sound, very basic science. However, that's a tiny small minority of the people who know those things or who care to know those things. For the average person, you go outside and you don't see anything disastrous happening. You don't see continents sinking. You don't see any significant changes in nature. And you conclude, hey, based on what I can see, there's no such thing as global warming. That's all nonsense. So it's something that's really difficult to make people aware of. It's hard to interest people into understanding. It's hard to interest people into learning something that they frankly just don't see as a problem. The average person walking down the street couldn't care less. It's a huge challenge for us who are in science communication.
While doing research, have you encountered any exaggerations or misrepresentations from the left? Because the first thing that people would say is that there's doomsday sayers from the left, that they make prognostications that are far-fetched to kind of scare people and to get them to comply to the laws that they want to pass, instead of providing true facts, and that they take some survey or whatever and either the media or some celebrities make it more than what it is, and that kind of loses credibility in the long run. Have you ever seen that?
Absolutely. In any kind of an environmental issue, you have people who deliberately exaggerate the facts in an honest effort to attract more attention to solving those. A great example that's an obvious one is the Pacific garbage patch, supposedly the solid island of floating garbage that's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Almost anything you hear about on the news is tremendously exaggerated. They feel that by exaggerating the problem, that by describing it as far more, a lot more visible trash than is actually the case, they feel that that'll attract more attention and motivate more action. And you could even go back to the beginning of when global warming really entered the public consciousness with Al Gore's film. The predictions that Al Gore presented in An Inconvenient Truth can be reasonably described as well outside the range of the actual probabilities that are predicted. Now, I say that, but I'm not trying to trivialize or minimalize what the actual situation is. The situation with global warming is extremely dire. The problem is we're at the very beginning of the slope right now, where there hasn't really been anything happening that people can go outside and observe for themselves. Unless you're doing things like observing the CO2 content, the energy absorption in the upper atmosphere, these things that are absolutely observable and measurable today, but the average person on the sidewalk doesn't see them. We are on a slope that is very rapidly becoming irretrievable. And at this very, very early stage of the results, we're fairly well into the stage of the cause with the excess carbon being added to the atmosphere, but we're just at the very beginnings of the results, and we're so far into the cause that we're rapidly losing control of the situation. Now, since the average person can go outside and say, "Hey, I don't see any global warming. I don't need to change the car I drive or encourage my congressman to stay in the Paris Accords or leave the Paris Accords," we've got a big problem. And so it kind of makes sense. I can understand why someone would want to exaggerate the problem, hoping to grab the public's attention.
So how do we get the Michael Moores and the Leonardo DiCaprios to calm down and not make a farce of the real scientific truth?
Well, here's the thing. In order to solve a problem, you need to have an accurate understanding of the problem. That's the case with the Pacific garbage patch. And I'm just giving that's a little bit different example, but it's one that's very easy to understand because we can all go on the internet and look at photographs of trash floating in water. The actual situation for the amount of plastic that's out there, while it is a problem, it's a very different problem than can be addressed by some of the solutions that people are throwing money at right now. They're building the wrong kind of machines to solve a problem that's too different from what the machine was designed for. Now, with global warming, on the other hand, if you look at the celebrities who are making movies to try and shock the public into action, I'm not sure there's much downside to that because, as I said, we're so far into the cause. The cause has already started so many things in motion that it's a very difficult, if not impossible, problem to resolve already. So I'm not sure that I would spend a lot of energy on trying to calm down the people who are exaggerating that problem. Although, you'd also have to take a look at the specific example. What exactly are they exaggerating? And are they exaggerating it in a way that is going to lead us to take inappropriate steps to solve it? That's what's really important. Is the action we're taking appropriate, or is it wrong based on wrong information?
Well, a friend of the show was very disturbed by Leonardo DiCaprio's claim that the only way we can help the environment is if we outlaw meat, that beef consumption is creating a lot of pollution, and that if we got rid of that, then things would be better. It just seemed outrageous to impose that on all humanity. Have you heard about that claim?
Yeah, I have. I certainly don't think that that's the solution that's going to make everything wonderful. When you look at the beef industry, it honestly does have a disproportionate effect on the environment because it has so many trickle-down effects. All the way through the agriculture needed to support the feed for the beef cattle, the tractors that are needed to run the agriculture. It goes so far down, and there's a big pyramid behind it. So it would be great to get off of beef and move to a different type of food product that's going to be equally satisfactory for consumers of beef. What is that? I don't know. We need to find that, though, before we can expect much action to happen there. But I certainly don't agree that that's the number one thing we should do. The number one thing we should do is to get off of fossil fuels. We should absolutely not be opening any more coal plants, at least coal that's to be used for powering power plants. China opens, I believe, a new coal mine every 3 days. I could be incorrect on that, but that's information that's at least a few months old, I believe. That's wrong. China is also opening nuclear power plants faster than anyone else in the world, and that's a great thing. That's a great example that more people should follow because that's carbon neutral. We need to be buying more electric cars. We need to be generating more electricity with renewable sources, carbon neutral sources. That's really where we need to make the most progress most quickly, is to get off of fossil fuels.
Well, here on our show, we broadcast through Radio Free Nashville, and we have a lot of alternative news, such as Democracy Now! and people who... There's a left-leaning perspective, but sometimes it's a little more consistent because they actually challenge both Democratic and Republican parties. And I know it's a little off subject, but it's still connected. You talked about spin. I'm very devastated about the U.S. leaving the Paris Accords, and especially this idea that is being mischaracterized as a bad deal and something that was actually going to destroy the U.S. economy. Can you really quick debunk that idea, because it angers me that happened, and then they have the nerve to even change the facts to push their own perspective that is actually not accurate.
Well, I'm not sure I disagree with that, actually. And the reason is, take the example of, let's say you've got two children, and one of them has bone cancer and the other one doesn't. You're going to have to spend a lot more money solving the bone cancer for the one child than you are for the other child. That's two different nations who, one of them has a big fossil fuel dependency problem and the other one doesn't. Yes, that one is going to be hit financially much harder. Yes, the financial requirements of following the plan are going to be a lot more unfair to that one nation. Just like you're going to have to spend a lot more money on your one child than your other child, and you can say that that's unfair. So it's actually a reasonable description of the issue. But if you understand it that way, you have to spend more resources where there's a bigger problem. Yes, no duh, that's the way it's going to work. If you say every nation has to spend $1,000 on reducing fossil fuels, then that might go a long way in a tiny, tiny, tiny nation. It's going to go nowhere in a large nation. So nations like the United States are going to have to foot a larger part of the bill because they've created a larger problem. China probably top of the heap. And there's, going back to the Kyoto Protocol from a long time ago, Kyoto Protocol, in my opinion, truly did deserve much of the criticism that the political right leveled at it, because in my analysis of that, it was far more disproportionate. It was largely an anti-U.S. plan, while giving a complete pass to China and India. It was very poorly designed, and the Paris Accords are far better. However, the Paris Accords, following the Paris recommendations, are going to mean that the U.S. has to spend more than, say, Australia. Australia has 16 people living in the entire country. No matter how hard they try, they simply can't affect global climate, global carbon output that much. But the U.S. does tremendously. So, yes, it is unfair to the United States. And yes, we have to swallow that and move on with it and accept it.
You were kidding about 16 people. That's an exaggeration, right?
It's more than 16. It's somewhere in the 20s.
Okay, so, but at the same time, it's an agreement that it was reworked so many times, and they had everybody in the U.S. agree on it under the Obama administration. But it's like self-regulating. There's no, you can't go to jail if you don't followed through. There is no way to do checks and balances other than, I guess, the reputation of the country being at stake, and I guess the reputation has already gone down to the drain, so we don't really have to worry about that. So that's the problem, is like they were portraying it as being bound by these crazy other nations to follow this crazy conspiracy theory that climate change exists. And having 95 countries in it, to me, is really shameful. Like, there's a point, I'm not the biggest environmentalist in the world, but I do have issues with man-made pollution. But there's a point where the majority of the scientists think it's happening. The majority of the countries are willing to do something about it. And for us to be that stubborn and say, well, I don't care, it doesn't mean anything to me, that's just ridiculous. And I'm just like really disappointed. I thought that there was already enough bad things that had happened up until now, but this kind of breaks the camel's back for me, because, who can be against saving the world or taking care of nature for the sake of the future generations?
Well, I'll tell you who. It's the people who don't believe that there's a problem. And going back to what I said earlier, because you can walk outside on the sidewalk and you don't see that the nation is sinking under rising ocean levels. Because there's no immediate apparent effects, people simply don't believe that it's a problem in many cases. And so they see no need to cripple ourselves economically. They see no need to close down our fossil fuel industry. Because all the apparent evidence shows is that there's no problem. It's a difficult problem. It's a really difficult problem for people in my position to educate the public and get them to understand that these problems are real. That's why I do what I do 7 days a week. And in this particular political climate, where the wind has shifted to favor those who do not acknowledge the existence of a problem, it makes my job not only harder, but also a lot more important.
Well, let's go back to fake news and spin. I'm very troubled. Like, I'm all for free speech and the exchange of ideas, but the rising of militant groups and supremacist groups and hateful groups, and being given equal time or equal access to, having rallies in the streets, or having using credit card companies to have donations to them, saying that it's just their perspective and we can't stop people from spouting hatred. Do you think that's going to lead to a similar situation like in Europe, where extremists from certain religions are allowed to preach hatred and destruction, and they don't want to do anything about it because they don't want to offend them or they don't want to infringe on their rights? Like, is that what it's turning into? That is kind of laissez-faire mentality that is going to let radical groups create their own reality and push that on campuses and around the country?
Well, are you saying that unless we clamp down on their right to publish whatever they want to write on the internet, that they're going to gain a foothold?
Well, it's like the school that I went to followed a similar, my previous guest, he believes that no matter what your perspective is, everybody should be given equal access. And I keep on getting letters from my alma mater asking me for donations, and then I find out that they invited a right-wing provocateur who's racist, sexist, anti-Semitic to speak in the school. And I'm like, I know that free speech and all that, but like, people's lives are at stake, in the sense of the more that this type of fake information and conspiracy theories are being pushed, the more people are going to believe them, and the more people from those minority populations are at danger. And so now everybody's hiding behind free speech. And I know that politically people can be swayed, or they can be shamed, or if what they're saying is not true, is going to be proven in the long haul or whatever. But I worry that it's kind of like Nazi Germany and places like that, where next thing you know, if you get enough momentum and if you get enough people to have access to that false information, you can actually create a movement that can cause a lot of trouble for individuals. So again, it's like the shield of free speech is infringing on a lot of people, not at this point, but is leading in that way. And I had another guest who is an expert on Nazi Germany, and she said it is troubling because they didn't start hurting people. They started creating a false narrative, and then slowly they wrapped everybody around that cause, and then it brought about mass destruction. So I'm just very troubled that free speech has become kind of like the freedom to insult, hurt, attack people, and nobody wants to do anything about it because.
Well, it hasn't become that. That's what it's always been. That's the whole reason we have the First Amendment. I mean, painless speech does not need an amendment to protect it. Offensive, hateful speech needs an amendment to protect it. That's the whole reason we have free speech, is that so people can express opinions that are hateful and offensive to other people. I think that's very important, and that needs to remain.
Are you familiar with the Skokie case where a neo-Nazi group was trying to rally or parade in a mostly Jewish neighborhood where they were Holocaust survivors, and it instilled so much fear in the people there that I don't know what happened. I don't know if it got shut down because of that, but it was a provocation in a form of emotional abuse to the people of that population. So that's the kind of stuff that to me is crossing the line, and we're getting really close to that. Like that one provocateur went to a part of the country where there's a large Hispanic population, and then he was saying deport everybody, and there was a protest because people felt threatened by that. So there's this kind of like really like coming at odds and changing the narrative to demean people and like dehumanize them, and somehow they're still protected. And this person is an immigrant. So.
But you're talking about two different things. You're talking about freedom of speech. That's not freedom to threaten. Threatening and freedom of speech are not the same thing. Threatening somebody is a crime. Freedom of speech is not a crime. You can express your opinions without threatening someone. Once you cross the line into abusing people, threatening people, then you're actually in violation of the law. We have very good laws that manage that stuff now. I don't think we need to, I'm certain that we don't need to limit free speech to prevent things that are already illegal.
So what people will call hate speech, do you think that that's an overreach on free speech, or is it appropriate for, if you can prove cause and effect that because of the words of someone was hurt, then it should be put in a different category than just regular inciting or getting people hurt? Because that's one of the conservative claims, like, don't call it hate speech, call it provocation or inciting a riot or a conflict. The moment that you create a different category, then you become the thought police and you're coming after people for their views.
Well, coming after people for their views that's not acceptable. Coming after people for their actions, if their actions violate some law, that's absolutely acceptable. None of these are super simple, super cut and dried issues, and there's always going to be people who feel too strongly or not strongly enough about any place that you could draw a line. But, basically, freedom of speech gives you the right to express whatever opinion you want. You can't do it in a harmful way, like I can't go up to someone on the street and start punching them and demand that they embrace my point of view, or I'm going to kill them and their family. I've just exercised my free speech, but I've also physically assaulted, physically, verbally threatened somebody, and a verbal threat is an assault under the law as well. I've just broken a whole bunch of laws. We don't need to blame free speech for what just happened there.
Well, yeah, there's something that is very complex, and different shows and intellectuals have tried to wrap their minds around them, but I just think it's connected to this idea of fake news and information that sways people and can actually provoke people to do negative things. And we keep seeing both political parties or ideologies, conservative and progressive, blaming each other for violence. Like whenever there's a violent act, they'll say, well, it's because of their party affiliation or because of their ideology that they went and did something terrible. Is that another political tactic, or can at times there be a cause and effect in that way?
Well, if we look at the Pizzagate case, and let's say the guy who went down there with a gun, let's say he went down there and he shot somebody, and then let's say we tracked down the original person who wrote the article and posted it somewhere specific. Let's say we had all of those facts. I think that it would be very possible to decide who had committed some crime and who had not. Did the article make an explicit incitement to violence? That would be a crime. Did it not? Did it just say, hey, Hillary Clinton is currently sexually assaulting a 8-year-old child in the back of this restaurant? That person has not committed a crime because they didn't say you should go down there with a gun and kill anybody. You can't. Hillary Clinton would not have any standing to sue that person for slander or whatever because she's a public figure. All of these things are already covered by very good laws, and that's why we have such a large judicial system and law enforcement system to manage all this. The issues are complicated and they are thorny, and we do have to address them in the courts. I think what's dangerous is the idea of there is a simple solution to all of this, and that's making some draconian change to our basic freedoms. I think that's where we're likely to get into trouble.
Well, there was another debate I saw where they were talking about how statistics are used to push an agenda, and some ideologies are taking over different fields like social studies, and they have kind of like some driving force behind their findings and trying to change things by force as compared to just allowing the evidence to speak for itself. So is there such a thing as unscientific or trends that you see, political trends that are taking over American society? I know it's a tough question, but there's certain movements that have become untouchable, that if someone makes a joke or somebody says something inappropriate, they come hard on people politically, and they try to defame them or destroy their reputation. Are you worried about that? Does it seem like it's become a type of Orwellian type of thing where political, and that's the biggest accusation, that political correctness is taking over, but then they use it as an excuse to be offensive. So we're not being politically correct, so we can stereotype people and talk bad about them. Do you think that, and again, this is generalizations, do you think that sometimes the left can be, the social justice warriors can be as forceful as the conservative pundits in trying to push their agendas without actually respecting people's views and allowing for multiple perspectives?
Well, sure. I think people are people. It doesn't matter whether they're on the left or they're on the right. People are. Every group has all kinds of people in it. Is a mantra that I always try to follow when I'm pondering these questions. The fact is that the internet has made a lot of changes in culture, and it's made misinformation, spun information, deliberate or honest misinformation. It's made all of these things easier to spread. In previous decades, newspapers all had agendas, and newspapers would spread as much quote-unquote fake news as the internet does today. So it's not a new phenomenon, but what's new is the speed and the volume at which misinformation can travel and spread. And the tools to deal with it have not quite kept up. So I do agree with you. I think, yes, there is a problem, and it is a cause for concern. And that's why there's so many different parallel efforts at work trying to solve this. You've got sites like Facebook and Google using voluntary fact-checking services. There's upsides and downsides to that. You've got Facebook is employing third-party flagging of stories that are posted. They're employing user-style flagging. Users can upvote, downvote the quality of stories. You've got algorithmic solutions to fake news where technology companies are working on algorithmically looking at news stories and trying to see, is this true or is this not? Is this just spin, or is it deliberately fake? And there's a lot of different variables they have to look at. They have to look at the source. They have to look at the content. It's a very difficult problem. And then you've got things like what I try to do with just education, with giving people the tools to solve these things for themselves. That's got a downside in that there's only a small number of people who are going to be willing to do that. And then you've got legal recourses. You've got things like in Germany they're experimenting with criminalizing the publication of false information. I think that's fraught with difficulties. I don't think that would work in the United States at all. You've got more pragmatic solutions like taking away the economic base of people who habitually spread misinformation by banning their ability to run advertising on their sites. I think something like that has got a lot of potential to be good. So it's not like these problems are under the radar and there's nobody working on them. We are working on them. We're working very hard in many cases, but they're really difficult problems, and it's something that we haven't really had to work at solving before. Particularly in the past year, events have really brought this to the surface, and so we're working at it harder than ever. It's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Well, let's talk about news on themselves. The idea of reporting or investigative reporting is not a science. It's not something that has to be corroborated by all sources. It's a set of perspectives, and sometimes they get a specialist or an expert on the subject. But from what I know of news, there's a beat to the reporter's plan to execute the story, and there's a particular goal in mind. Like, you get all the facts, but then you write the story to kind of fit the theme that you were going for. So how do you? To me, it sounds even dangerous to have people vote on, is this real or not, because you could say that it's based on what perspective. And if you're talking to, progressive news claim that they talk to common sources, like they talk to people affected by an issue instead of talking to politicians and spokespeople who are going to give you their version of the facts. So it all depends on from what standpoint you are approaching the issue. So how do you measure that? I think that's something that the people need to think about before they start judging the truthfulness of a story.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're pointing out one of the difficulties that the people working on solving this are facing. That's absolutely a problem. If you're attempting to help guide users by presenting them with sort of crowdsourced feedback for the validity of an article, that's going to be susceptible to the hive mind of the crowd that gave the feedback on it. There are plenty of things in popular culture where arguably you can say more people believe the false version than the true version. Organic food is a great example. If you ask the average person on the street is organic food healthier? The average person is going to say, well, yes, it is. You should choose organic food. Now, of course, that's an unscientific perspective. Scientifically, there's no reason why you would select organic food. However, if that was the news story and users were upvoting it, yay or nay, is this fake news or not, that's going to get more yeses than nos. So that's a weakness of that effort. And that's why none of these efforts is going to be the solution all by itself. We're going to have to work together on all of these. If you go with some of the fact-checking services, for example, there's a nonprofit called Pointer that's working with, I believe, Facebook and Google to come up with a source of fact-checking organizations that will, score the articles to the best of our factual ability to do so, and even that's problematic. That's probably a better source than the user-sourced, the user flagging. None of them are perfect. None of them are perfect, and we have to work together with all of them before we're going to see which are they going to have the best legs, which of these solutions is going to end up working the better in the long run.
Are you familiar with, going back to Nazis, their way of dismissing the news and the media by saying that it was all fake news? And then the socialists have this idea that in governing, you get rid of the media, so like that you don't have any dissenting views, and government can move forward and smoothly without being questioned. Tell us a little bit about that if you're familiar with those concepts.
Actually, I couldn't tell you enough about that. That's not something I've studied. Because
that's the trend now. Like anytime that something does not fit the agenda of the political party, they say, well, it's just fake. And unnamed sources means that it was made up. Does it show like a lack of understanding of how reporters protect their sources?
I can say it illustrates the complexity of the problem, because those are all valid issues. Reporters do need to protect their sources in many cases, and that's a good thing, and that needs to remain. And it's going to be a problem for verifying a story. It's just not simple.
And are you familiar with any point in history where fake news were used to sway a war or to create conflict? In our previous show, we talked about false flags doing that, but was there any, I guess, there was that one where they said that they had won the war and then it was a mistake, but was there any, government-issued news that try to change the minds and hearts of populations of different countries that you're aware of?
Yep, every single war that's ever happened. That's why we have propaganda ministries, and this is something that intelligence services have been doing in every war. Is churning out propaganda that supports the good guys and makes the bad guys look bad. This has been the case in the United States, in Europe, in every war that I'm aware of, probably going back into prehistory. Propaganda has very much been a part of international conflict, and that's going to continue to be the case.
So what people should really be worried about is where the media becomes too cozy with the government, because where I come from, in Mexico, they're all friends, and we don't have a state-run TV channel, but they're pretty much state-run because they were given access to the politicians, but they have to push the party line. So whenever I see, the president or certain politicians be too friendly with the media, it seems like that's a problem, because the only way you can get them to be on your show or to give you access is if you make them look good. And then there's also the hype about the fake news. It seems like we talk so much about fake news that we forget about the real news. And do you think that Facebook and the accessibility to information is also adding to the problem, because now you have people posting and reposting ridiculous stuff? I know we've talked about anti-Semitism and stuff like that, and there's this one person that kept on posting stuff about the not the Rockefeller, what was the other group? The Rothschilds. And no matter how many times I told them, that's been debunked and that's not true, they were like, but it's right there in the article. And, they seem to be really bad people. And so it was kind of like, it was just feeding to the paranoia. So there was a point where I said, I don't want to hear anything that is reposted. I want people to speak from their own hearts and like from what they know. And that's why we kind of got the show going again here, because we wanted to put out information that hopefully is a little more reliable, and to get some academic stuff out there, because there was so much, for lack of better terms, junk. Have you seen suppression of the news outlets or the media, or persecution of investigative reporters to this point? And do you think that things are okay, or are things getting bad for people who are actually trying to create news that are more reliable?
Well, the only thing I've seen that I would characterize as an effort to suppress the news in recent memory is what's currently happening with the White House press situation, with banning certain reporters from coming in, and efforts like that are kind of silly and kind of naive. The idea that that's going to help you make yourself look better in the news by telling certain reporters that they're not allowed to report anything about you, that's pretty childish, and it's kind of amusing to see the results of how that's going to work out. But other than that, suppression of news has always been historically next to impossible, and I think is even more so today. That's not something that I'm too worried about.
Well, in other countries, that's a daily thing, where in Mexico, reporters are being killed all the time, and in some areas in the Middle East. So do you feel that we're, in a sense, blessed to have a robust media, but then we also have the involvement of corporations? And again, there was a previous administration where you could only be part of the press conference if you were going to throw softball questions to the press secretary or the president. Now,
yeah, but that immediately strikes back at itself, because immediately that has no credibility, and everybody knows that it has no credibility when you have that kind of a situation. So, that's exactly kind of what we're seeing in the White House today, when they say, okay, these three newspapers that I don't like are not allowed to show up to my press conference. People just laugh at what comes out of that press conference then. Nobody's that childish. It is so easy to get information from outside, from unbiased, or from sources that are biased in the way you prefer to be biased, that it's the idea of stopping news, stopping the signal is just, I don't know. I'm not concerned about that at all. Even in some of the countries that you talk about, it is so easy for anyone with just the most basic computer knowledge to get around any kind of firewall, get around any kind of blocking of the internet. These are just trivial issues from a technical perspective now, and they're pretty much ignored worldwide.
The point that I was going to